welcome to this recording in progress. And as we welcome people into the waiting room, from the waiting room into the event, we'll be just giving it another minute or two as we welcome a couple of other attendees, as well as a couple of our speakers. So I can see online we've got Andrew Prag. Welcome, Andrew. I can't hear
Thank
you.
you, Andrew.
And I can indeed, yes.
Yeah.
And I can see room RSRC, and I'm wondering if that's Ilona. And if it is, I'll do allow to talk because that might help. There we go. And it is.
Hi, Andrew.
It is indeed you, in which case I will move you to promote to panelist. Yes, there we go. Wonderful. All right. So we're going to be welcoming a few more people into the webinar. We've had an interesting time in Australia at the moment with the webinars over the last couple of days because of the impact that Cyclone Alfred or Tropical Low Alfred has had on these events. But thank you so much for joining us, for those who have been able to join us. And in particular, thank you for joining this event, which is part of Climate Action Week, which hopefully you can see on the screen. The opportunity to have a conversation in Australia around a variety of topics on the issue of climate ambition, climate action, and climate accountability. And this is part of one of the official events that is going on this week as part of the business segment of the work that's going on in the conference program. All right, let's kick off, and just wanting to make absolutely sure we've got everything in play. We have indeed. So let's start by commencing in usual form by welcoming you, and in particular acknowledging that the event is being broadcast to you from the land of the Camaragal people. And we acknowledge their elders past, present, and emerging. And I've just noticed that there's a hand up. Bob Webb, hello, Bob. Let me just quickly open allow to talk. Bob. No, can't hear.
Sorry, my mistake.
No, that's all right. It's technology for you. All right, so I will return you to mute. All right, so in the opening, as I say, we acknowledge that we are broadcasting to you from the land of the Camaragal people and acknowledge their elders past, present, and emerging. This is a conversation that has been started actually much time ago, and as you would appreciate, particularly from the Australian perspective, the conversation of our ambition under the nationally determined contribution is one that has been fraught with much political interest, but perhaps not as much engagement by the whole of the Australian civil society in how we go about creating what is ostensibly Australia's climate plan, and then how we go about ratcheting that particular plan over a period of time to a point at which we, in Australia at least, have committed to this concept of net zero by 2050. So with that, and because this is the year in which all countries that are party to the Paris Agreement, and we'll get to all of that terminology during the course of the discussion, but during that exercise, countries like Australia have committed to updating, ratcheting as it's called, updating their plan for decarbonisation, and the target setting date is the 2035, hence it being referenced in the title. And what I wanted to do was very quickly go through just a quick setting the scene, and then giving you some observations around the overview of the NDC, And why I think, and this organisation, the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, and we in Australia, the global network partner to the WBCSD, being BCSD Australia, I think it's important. And then how Australia is going to play an important role in the discussion, debate, and hopefully lodgement of its NDC later in the year. And to do that, we're going to be supported by two very prominent, well-known speakers, the first being Andrew Prag, who is the head of policy from We Mean Business Coalition, who's dialing in all the way from the other side of the world, and that doesn't mean Queensland, it actually means the other side of the world. And then we're going to hear from Ilona Millar, who's a senior partner at a law firm, Gilbert Tobin, to explain what I call the hard and soft aspects of what an NDC is about and how that is important for Australia. Then we'll go into a Q&A discussion with those panellists, but we'll also welcome to the discussion a dear friend, but more importantly, the head of partnerships at Better Futures Australia, Lisa Cliff, who is, as we speak, returning from Queensland to New South Wales to be part of the Climate Action Week program here in Sydney. So we look forward to that. And with that, you'll have an opportunity through the Q&A function, which I believe is working. And if it's not, then somebody put their hand up and tell me. And we'll be able to hopefully field a few questions from you in relation to this particular topic. All right, so let me give you my 2 cents worth in relation to the issue of NDCs and why they are important to Australia. Obviously, as I said before, from a definition and purpose point of view, they are each country's climate action plan under the Paris Agreement, and they outline how we as a country will reduce and adapt to climate change. Interestingly, they're not a legally binding agreement, and I will very much welcome Ilona's reflections on this as we go into the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change negotiations this year in Brazil, in Belém, at what's called COP30. So the targets themselves aren't actually legally binding, but countries are and have committed to submit updated and increased ambition under these NDCs every 5 years. Hence, we are now looking at one for 2035, because obviously our one in 2030 we will come to in a minute. Its key components, as I understand it, include an economy-wide emissions reduction target, sector-specific policies, and then adaptation measures, and even investment plans. So in one sense, it's incredibly comprehensive. And yet, have we all seen one in Australia? Have we understood what it means? Because in one sense, it's a very important economic, as well as scientific, as well as community document. This notion of the 1.5 degree or Celsius goal under the Paris Agreement calls for keeping global warming well below the 2 degrees Celsius, ideally limiting it to 1.5, as the NDC is primarily the mechanism to actually achieve that. So if we don't use that mechanism, what will be the one that keeps our line of sight, our light on the end of the hill, in relation to how we're going to achieve that particular aspiration? So the next target is, in fact, technically has passed. We should have lodged our NDC earlier in February, and countries like Australia have not yet done so. But they must submit their NDC by the end of this calendar year for 2035, and our Prime Minister and our Climate Minister have already indicated that we will be doing this immediately, and discussion and negotiation and then ultimately commitment will be made by whichever government succeeds in the election after we have our federal election, possibly probably no later than the 17th of May. With that, I might go into welcoming Andrew to a conversation about what this means on an international level. And Andrew, you were recently in India, and the conversation we had last week in relation to what was going on in India, I thought was quite revelatory, which I won't steal your thunder by explaining why I think that. But give us some sense of, firstly, who is We Mean Business Coalition? I know them, and I'm sure that a number of people who have dialed in may know them as well, but some don't. And what's its role in relation to this particular issue? And what's your observation thus far in relation to the world's preparation for its commitment around these 2035 climate action plans? Over to you, Andrew.
Thank you very much, Andrew. Can you hear me okay?
Very well,
Good.
thank you.
A bit of a camera issue, that's why I'm connected twice, but anyway, I am here.
Okay.
So thank you very much for the invitation. I should have a few slides, if I can share my screen, if that's all right.
Yes, of course you can.
Good.
So let me
Okay, yeah, well,
jump.
and while you're authorizing that, so I'm here and Managing Director of Policy at the Women Business Coalition, based in fact in the French Alps on the other side of the world. So very nice to see you right from over here. And let me just begin by saying how sorry I am to see over the impacts, the terrible damage you're having from the storm Alfred up there in northern New South Wales and South Queensland. Yeah, has reached our ears over here in the press. We don't always get Australian news, but we have been reading about it, and very sorry to see that, and hope that the West is now past. Okay, now I can share. Thank you.
At least it wasn't a conversation about somebody being eaten by a shark, which is what Europe usually gets stories about.
Okay.
Over to you.
Thanks. And again, thank you for the invitation. So we are the We Mean Business Coalition. What we are is an international network of business organizations focused on driving greater action on climate change and energy transition. So we've been around for about 10 years now, founded before the Paris Agreement in 2014. And at the time, by the 7 business organizations you can see on the screen here. And they realized at the time that there was just a need for a single sort of umbrella organization to really amplify and focus that voice of ambitious business into policymaking, whereas before then it'd been quite disparate. And the idea that there would be genuine ambitious business voice pushing for the stronger policies and the genuine transformation was a new idea at the time. Since then, we've grown into this great global network. I mean, one of our founding partners is the World Business Council Sustainable Development. And so through that, we work with excellent regional organizations such as BCSD Australia. And now through all these networks and initiatives that we've been involved with, including co-founding science-based targets initiatives, we reckon we reach around 20,000 businesses. It's becoming quite a significant network internationally. One of our sort of one of our sort of orientations at the moment is through what we call the 4 A's of corporate climate leadership, which is where we try and guide companies into becoming climate leaders and using their voice effectively to accelerate the world's transition. So these are ambition, action, advocacy, and accountability. It's fairly self-explanatory that you really need to be setting that ambition. And this is where the science-based targets come in and really showing that the companies are setting out to make this transition. The action side of things, obviously, ambition is nothing without actual action. Very importantly, and what my part of the organization does is the advocacy side. So really making sure that when businesses are acting and they are pushing policies to help them in that direction, and then to stimulate obviously action from others, and then accountability, showing that this ambition and action is actually happening, and we've got the reporting and disclosure and accountability to when companies to that companies do what they say they're doing. This on this question of the nationally determined contributions, we're really in the kind of advocacy side of things about how companies really drive that forward. Just some quick examples of how we've sort of used this machinery of advocacy from our global business networks to try and drive change. One is this campaign we launched in 2023 called Fossil to Clean, which was aimed at the big international climate conference at the end of that year, COP28 in Dubai. Was big question on the table was whether companies would agree finally to actually do something about fossil fuels overall, which amazingly had been absent essentially from the negotiations in all the 25 plus years before then. And so this campaign really showed businesses were pushing for that and wanted to see it. And we were very visible at the COP, and the feedback we got afterwards that really helped the more progressive countries to sort of strengthen their hand and push and get this outcome that we did get on agreeing transition away from fossil fuels. Obviously, the international politics has moved again since then, but still that was quite a landmark. Going back again, I mean, this feels a bit like ancient history. The last round when countries had to update their NDCs, we had a strong push in the United States with the new Biden administration at the time. And just I'm not going to talk through all this, but just to show the kind of action and reaction we're going to have, we pulled together with our partner in the US series a letter from a large number of businesses and business NGOs, which got that out in the press in the Wall Street Journal, sent it to the president. It was picked up by John Kerry, and he was climate envoy at the time. In his press briefings, the US NDC was announced, and then feedback we then got from the administration was again, that was very helpful in strengthening their hand, just to show that this business advocacy really counts and can help. And then our most recent example, again, on the other side of the world for you, but you may have been following this kind of storm going on in Brussels on the kind of business sustainability legislation side of things, with the new European Commission has a strong push for improving competitiveness, in part by simplifying the regulations and the red tape and the burden on business, which is necessary, but it's been kind of co-opted by companies and political parties really pushing for complete deregulation in the name of simplification. So we've been helping to sort of orient a defense campaign by businesses pushing for that they do want these regulations. They want them to be simplified and improved, but it's not about deregulation across these kind of major packages. So we had a letter in the FD, we had letters to the President of the European Commission, and just again showing that there is an ambitious business voice here. Right, turning a bit more to the topic on the table today. So these nationally determined contributions. This, we, as Andrew very rightly introduced, this is a key moment in this international sphere. This particular year is when countries have to put forward these new national commitments. So we saw last year a great opportunity to really make sure there is a strong, ambitious business voice internationally on this topic. So we launched in September what we call our call to action for ambitious and investable NDCs, which you can see at that link if you want to browse through the document. And what this did was set out a framework for what business needs to see in general, in a kind of international level from these documents, and pointing out very importantly that it's not just about the NDC itself, which is an important signal, but it's also about how it gets translated into policy itself. I'll come to that in a moment. But basically, we trying to make the case, firstly showing to the global business community why these NDCs actually matter, because of course for a lot of businesses this is something pretty distant. It's a piece of paper being discussed in the UN. It's not actually the regulations, the incentives, the policy measures that are impacting businesses and investment on the ground in different countries. But we're trying to make the case that it is an important signal. It may not be legally binding, as Andrew said, but it is an important signal about the direction of travel of the policy environment, and potentially going beyond individual electoral cycles, and just gives that business confidence that that domestic policies will go in that direction and provide that long-lived, clear policy framework that investment craves in this area. And then on the other side, why do businesses matter for the NDC process? And needless to say that there is no transition without the private sector acting, and that investment and major capital shifts in the private sector is going to be essential. But also making the point that the voice counts. As I was saying before, have these examples where businesses getting together and speaking up and using their voice and their weight and their political clout to push for these kind of policies really does move the needle in many cases. So we structured it around what we call these three pillars. And this is really to emphasize what I said about the fact that it's not just about the document that gets put forward in the UN, it's about then how that impacts the flow of policy implementation back at home and how businesses are involved in that process. So pillar one is the NDC itself, about putting forward the ambitious NDC, including economy-wide targets that really show the overall level of ambition and the direction of travel, including also more specific sectoral targets and commitments. And then an important commitment in the document itself that it is going to translate into policies and what those policies may look like, to show that it is not just words and that there is genuine commitment and ambition behind this. Then the pillar two is really to make sure that the link between this document in the UN and the actual policies, measures implemented on the ground is clear. So we go through the kind of levels of policy making that, in general, again, on an international sort of generic level, you'd want to see from business side to get investment about the overall national strategy, the specific sectoral deployment and innovation policies, and then the levels of international coordination. Many of these transitions can't be done by one country alone, however big it may be. So the sort of international platforms and coordination is very important. And then lastly, the third pillar is really about the role of business in this process, along with other stakeholders, but making sure there is a transparent, inclusive, and genuine involvement of business in the design of these, over the overall framework, and also the policies themselves, in order that we get policies that are designed to be investable and actually make a positive difference on the ground. When we launched this, we got a number of quotes from different sort of CEOs around the world supporting it. It's the first part of that kind of advocacy pillar I talked about is getting major companies and their individual CEOs to sort of step up and use their voice. This is just one from India, Mahindra, and I used this to pick up on Andrew's introduction about I was indeed in Delhi in India last week, a number of events and meetings, and it's very interesting coming from Europe where, obviously we're all talking about the US and the US-EU relationship and what's going on in Ukraine, and then also domestically, what I mentioned earlier, that there's sort of storm in Brussels around sustainability regulations, and we get a bit wrapped up in our own bubble, and go to India and just realize that, while of course they have their own challenges domestically and structurally and so on, but the sense in the business community is just one of optimism and growth and opportunity. Right? It's especially in the clean energy sector where they just see the enormous market domestically. Actually quite well-designed policies locally that might get not talked about by India in the UN, but they're happening at the state, the subnational level, and I found that very refreshing because we get a bit caught up in our doom loop, and it's actually, again, not to say it's easy in India by any means, but there is a sense of which is there's of opportunity and growth, which was kind of refreshing to see. So just to conclude, really. This is an important moment internationally. We have obviously a shift in the international tone with change in the US administration, but that kind of makes it all the more important that the rest of the world continues to step up and show that this is not just about climate policies and environment, but really a statement that this is the future economy and this energy transition is happening. The current politics is kind of noise, and these NDCs are a way for countries to put their stake in the ground about seeing the sort of the vision of this is where we see the future. This is where this is good for business, not bad, burdensome for business in the medium term, and certainly in the long run. And therefore, it's a moment for the international community to step up and not sort of sit back. We've taken this now into country-specific levels. I won't talk through all of this, but the idea is, this was an international document, and it only really counts when it's made to be specific to individual country context. So working in a number of countries, including, of course, with Australia. So through this webinar, kind of kick things off today, and looking forward to talking how we might go forward with it. And then lastly, the kind of things we'd love to hear from you in this discussion as businesses is, well, firstly, do you plan to engage in this kind of advocacy around the Australia's NDC, and if so, how, and if not, what could change your view on that? And then what are the kind of policy focused areas that you think should be important for the NDC? So about the NDC itself, what we call our Pillar 1, about policy implementation, and about the engagement, Pillars 2 and 3. So that was all I wanted to say. Thank you very much for the attention and the invitation. Looking forward to some discussion and questions later.
Thanks, Andrew. And before I bring in Ilona, let me see if I've actually got this right. There we go. Yes, you posed a couple of questions, and we in fact had, thanks to Greg, who's on the call as well from We Mean Business, we pulled together a poll of a few questions, which I thought it might be handy for the next two speakers to see what the questions are before they do their piece. And so what I'll do is I'll launch the 4 questions, and we'll just give it a few minutes, because the last question is a slightly more complex one to actually answer, because you've got to rank it. But they're fairly easy to answer, but they go to some of the points that Andrew's just highlighted. And so, yeah, what we'll do is get you, hopefully, to be able to get onto the poll, because I have opened it. And the 4 questions are, should Australia's 2035 NDC include sectoral targets and timelines with the new economy-wide emission goal? Second question, how important is it for Australian government to consult with your sector in the development of the NDC? Kind of how long is a piece of string question, but it's an important one to ask. Thirdly, what are the top barriers that your organisation faces in reducing greenhouse gas emissions? And that's a multiple choice one of up to 3. And then finally, rank the following policies in terms of potential to enable your organisation to reduce its emissions further from what's highest to lowest. So we've got nobody participating yet, but I'm wondering if anybody can actually access it. So can somebody tell me if they can access it or not?
It's unfair that panelists and speakers can't answer it. I'll just say that.
Thank you, Lisa. Yes. Aha. We've had one. We've had at least one respond. Thank goodness. All right. I will give it until 2 minutes 30 and then I will stop. But please give us your thoughts. We are genuinely interested in understanding an Australian viewpoint on this. And I'll just end up embarrassing all of the attendees by telling them that only now 3 of the 12 participants have actually, now 4, see, just keep guilting people into answering. 5, the power of guilt or persuasion, as the case may be. While we're doing that, Andrew, you made the comment about, and it truly struck me when you said it last week in relation to, in one sense, the enthusiasm or the energy that's coming from India at the moment. Is that something that you're also seeing across Asia, or did you notice that it struck you particularly in relation to India?
I think it's don't have so much on the ground experience elsewhere in Asia, but it is a sense that I've heard coming back from colleagues and other partners across the region that basically there is that the storm going on, the sort of transatlantic storm going on is a long way from there, and potentially even opportunity for them. I mean, China is of course another world altogether, and the numbers speak for itself in terms of the kind of growth of both manufacturing and deployment of clean energy technologies in particular, and the sort of leadership they've taken there, with enormous levels of subsidization kind of across the board, both explicit and implicit, and that's led to massive market share. But yeah, through indirectly through colleagues and partners, and it is the kind of message we've been getting. Which doesn't necessarily mean these are not necessarily stepping up in terms of climate policy, or going to the UN and laying down ambition, but it's just kind of happening on the ground, and recognizing that is recognizing that difference of sort of language is important. We're not necessarily wrapped up in the question of tackling climate change here, which is great, how it should be, right? And it's just kind of core business opportunism, which is how it should be, frankly.
Very much so. Particularly as Australia's supply chain is very much Asia. So it's interesting to hear the reflections. Okay, I'll quickly share results. So to the first question, almost overwhelmingly, yes, Australia should include sectoral targets and timelines, and that will be a relief to at least the current Climate Minister, because that's exactly what he's planning. Question 2, how important is it for Australian government to consult with your sector? Interestingly, not very important for absolutely everybody, but not unimportant. So I would take that as on balance, yes. Question 3, the top 3 barriers. Admittedly, a small pooling group, but I think lack of infrastructure, 1, limited access to finance, and then tech constraints were considered to be the top 3. And then finally, in terms of ranking, that was handy. It told me which ones they were. Number 1, number 4, and number 3. Okay, so emissions pricing. Wow. Okay, interesting. It's back, people. Did it ever go away though? So we will share those because I've downloaded the results, and we'll share those in the follow-up report. But I really want to welcome Ilona to the discussion now. As is indicated at the opening, Ilona is a very well-regarded and highly credentialed lawyer in the climate space, and has been, much like myself, knocking around this space. It's a terrible way of putting it, Andrew. I shouldn't say that. We have been working very hard and diligently in this space for a number of years. And I thought it was very useful to get Ilona's input into the why should a company really have to do anything about involving itself in the NDC discussion. Because as I said up front and reinforced by Andrew, and I'm sure you will echo the comment, there's no legal obligation to do so. So why would a company involve itself in the NDC process? And what have you seen over the last few years, because you've been both advising companies, but also in some cases countries, around the role of the NDC in terms of setting a country's climate plan? So over to you, Ilona.
Great, thanks Andrew, and good evening, good afternoon, good morning to everyone joining the call. I'm dialing in from the Gadigal lands of the Eora Nation, and I pay my respects to elders past and present, and acknowledge any First Nations people on the call today. So Andrew, I think the statement that companies aren't sort of required to engage in the process or not that is probably sort of not the way to approach the NDC settings, because ultimately the settings that a country adopts in its NDC will largely be implemented through law, which then regulates companies in that jurisdiction, and that's very much what we see here in Australia. And therefore, engagement on the level of ambition in the NDCs, the approaches to sectoral pathways to achieve the NDCs will ultimately rest with business to comply with the legal and policy frameworks that governments adopt. So I thought I'd start by just sort of providing some context to the way in which Australia has gone about its own NDC target setting process, just to explain how that actually plays out in the Australian regulatory framework. So as many people would know, Australia sort of submitted its first and initial NDC with a target for 2030 of achieving 26 to 28% emissions below 2000 levels on an absolute and economy-wide basis. That was set shortly after the Paris Agreement was ratified by the previous government. In 2022, when the Labor government was elected, one of the first things it did was introduce and submit an updated NDC. And it's in that updated NDC that Australia ratcheted up its ambition for its 2030 target. And that was the commitment to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 43% below 2005 levels by 2030, and reaffirming the target to achieve net zero emissions by 2050. The Australian NDC is an economy-wide reduction commitment, and it covers all gases and all sectors in the Australian National Inventory. So it's a whole of economy-wide target. And the step up between the 2022 NDC and the previous one was seen as quite a significant step up. It's about a 15% increase on the upper end of the previous target. And so, this has sort of been an important step to demonstrate Australia's sort of commitment to Paris goals and the, well below 2 degrees with a view to 1.5 degree warming under the Paris Agreement. What Australia did in 2022, which was quite significant, was it passed the Climate Change Act, which enshrines the emission reduction target into law, and then also sets out the process that the government is required to go through to update and submit new NDCs on a 5-yearly basis. And I'll come back to that process in a minute. But in addition to enshrining the target as a legislative commitment, we also saw policy measures adopted to enable the achievement of that target, including through the renewable energy target of 82% renewable energy by 2030, and also amendments to the Greenhouse and Energy Reporting Act safeguard mechanism, which effectively puts in place, essentially an emissions budget for those highly emissions intense, large emitting facilities within Australia that are covered by the safeguard mechanism. And the government also put in place a process to develop sectoral policies for a range of material sectors in the context of emission reductions. So, we do then have that legislative framework that will apply to companies that will need to, if you're a safeguard facility, meet your baseline year on year out to 2030. and also the government itself can be held to account in respect of achieving its targets. In terms of what happens now for reviewing our NDC and submitting an updated NDC for 2035, a couple of things are quite important in the Climate Change Act. The first is in the objects of the Act, we talk about the objects of the Climate Change Act being to advance an effective and progressive response to the urgent threat of climate change, drawing upon best available scientific knowledge. And so I think it's really important that in setting our NDC, we have to be informed by best available science. The other important aspect of the object is that that independent advice from the Climate Change Authority will inform the greenhouse gas reduction targets to be included in a new or adjusted nationally determined contribution. And so that role of the Climate Change Authority is very important. In terms of the Climate Change Authority advising the Minister on these targets, the advice that the Climate Change Authority must include has to take into account social, employment and economic benefits of any new or adjusted target and the associated policies, including for rural and regional Australia. So there is a balancing of different impacts of the NDC, but also the physical impacts of climate change on Australia, including on rural and regional Australia. So the Climate Change Authority is conducting a multifaceted review to help inform the setting of the targets. There's also the requirement, and this sort of picks up on a point that Andrew made, that the Climate Change Authority must make provision for public consultation. And certainly that is a key component, an area where business can engage with the Climate Change Authority on its review of targets. And then also what we then have is an obligation on the Minister to have regard to any relevant advice that is given by the Climate Change Authority, but that doesn't prevent the Minister from having regard to other advice. So there is a bit of a, expectation that the CCA advice will inform the NDC, but it's not the only thing that will necessarily inform the Minister's decision on an updated NDC. So with that in mind, in April last year, the Climate Change Authority issued an issues paper on targets, pathways and progress, which was essentially the facilitation of a consultation process to solicit views on a number of issues related to policy and target setting for our next NDC. And that process received over 220 submissions from various organisations and stakeholders. Some of the things that I think it's important to look at in terms of what the Climate Change Authority's issues paper flagged. And so this is sort of, giving a sense of some of the things that will inform the final advice that the Climate Change Authority give to the Minister, which was expected to be given in October last year, but we haven't sort of heard anything more about that. And so we're still sort of, waiting to see, what any advice entails. But some of the things that I think are quite useful to think about that were flagged by the Climate Change Authority include, Australia's position and in the global context, taking into consideration economic and wellbeing considerations, technologies that will likely determine Australia's success in being able to achieve the emission reduction targets, along with sort of decisions and actions of government, business, investor, communities and individuals. So it's sort of pointing to the ability to set and achieve our targets has to take into account a range of different stakeholders. The Climate Change Authority took the view that an ambitious science-aligned target should focus on the 1.5 degree goal. and that an ambitious target is one that contributes to growing international momentum. So it's effectively saying Australia should be taking a leadership position when setting its NDC and be out there with ambition that, you know, takes into account the ambition of other countries, but also, you know, I think sets a bar, because what Australia does can both be impacted with and can influence other countries' targets. I think then it was also important for the Climate Change Authority to recognise that we do have an export-based economy, and so we need to think about how our role in achieving targets plays out in the context of global supply chains. And so when it's sort of, I think, if other countries are setting strong targets, then, you know, we can see the Climate Change Authority could see a pathway for green economy exports to sort of grow and prosper. But if we sort of see a shrinking from that sort of approach and countries not being as ambitious, then there's those risks associated with carbon leakage and border adjustments. And we've had a separate process to talk about climate carbon border adjustment mechanisms as well, which we're, again, still waiting for further sort of outputs on from the government. But sort of to sort of wrap up in short, the sort of authority was talking in that original issues paper that a target for 2035 in the range of 65 to 75% below 2005 levels would be ambitious, but could be achievable and sustainable if additional action was taken by governments, business, investors and households. So what we kind of have seen is the CCA putting out that range of 65 to 75% below 2005 levels as essentially, you know, the ballpark for where they would be, I think, recommending the government should go if the government is to set an ambitious NDC. I mentioned before that there were sort of over 220 submissions received during the consultation period, and they sort of, you know, took a range of different views on what the targets should be and how they should be achieved. You know, one of our leading, you know, iron ore export companies proposed a target of at least 75%. The Carbon Market Institute talked about a target of more than 70%, and a number of people spoke about sort of the actual mechanisms to achieve the NDC through, you know, ramping up renewable energy deployment, putting in place more effective sectoral policies and planning, and also flagging issues like just transition. So I think, you know, we've got that work from the Climate Change Authority on pathways. We also have the Climate Change Authority sectoral pathway review, which was released in September last year. And that sort of outlines the technological opportunities and challenges for individual sectors. And then we sort of finally had in December a progress report on where are we now and sort of where do we need to get to. And what that report has shown is that we're still quite a long way away from achieving our 2030 NDC, let alone sort of the step up that we need for 2035. So I think, you know, what I see is as being important is that continued momentum to advocate for ambition, because if we are sort of wanting to stay aligned with the goals of the Paris Agreement, 1.5 degrees, and respect and respond to best available science, we need to be stepping up to that ambitious range. And if we do that, if that's what the government sort of then takes forward when it submits its next NDC later this year, before the next COP, that will then have ramifications for business, because it will be business that will need to step up, and that step up will have to happen through adjustments to regulation and policy. You know, our renewable uptake, I think, you know, we're probably going to be pushing to achieve the 82% by 2030. I wouldn't see a significant ramp up of renewables, you know, between 2030 and 2035 necessarily. I think we'd still be staying within that sort of framing for renewable energy generation, which means that it's other sectors that will have to really pick up the load. So that's our agricultural sector industrial, commercial and buildings. And, you would expect that the safeguard mechanism would need to work harder. And what that might look like could include, some proposals that have been flagged have been, reducing the facility level threshold so it covers more facilities and, more emissions. But also looking at how that could be expanded to other sectoral approaches. Also looking at, deployment of other carbon pricing mechanisms across sectors other than those sectors covered by the safeguard mechanism and the carbon farming legislation. So I'll pause there, but happy to take questions. But that's sort of the landscape that we're in for setting Australia's next NDC.
And thank you for that. And yes, the BCSDA submission to that was 67%. I don't know why we ended up with 67%. We said 67% by 2035 with a commitment to fossil fuel phase out by 2032. I think we were quite explicit that it had to happen in this particular NDC at this time. A good moment in time to ask Lisa to put her video on. There she is, and welcome her. We should check in. Are you okay?
Hi.
And where are you?
Yes, I'm feeling very guilty because I just arrived in Sydney in the Eora Nation after leaving Yagara and Turrbal People's Country right before the mop-up's probably going to start. So yes, it was a hectic couple of days, not much sleep. But luckily, I'm very lucky to live up on Annerley Hill, so we didn't even lose power. But yeah, most people I know in Brisbane have had gone without power for days, and
yes.
So our good friend Monica is flooded in with her parents. So it's going to be a long cleanup and a lot of property damage. So it'll keep all of our friends working in the insurance sector very, very entertained, I imagine.
Well, Lisa, there'll be more mops when you get back, so have no fear of that. Welcome to the discussion, and just a quick context setting. You are Better Futures Australia. I picked a quick thumbnail of who they are and what they represent in this discussion about the NDCs.
Yes, so Better Futures Australia is a program run from Climate Action Network Australia that works to build the tent and bring in the non-state actors to work in implementing the Paris Climate Agreement. So we can we know it's going to take all of us to deliver that future. So civil society, getting the CANA members to work constructively with businesses, subnational governments, the broader civil society, universities and others. And we are one of the sister alliances for climate action. So globally, there's a network of accelerators with the Race to Zero. And I'm not sure if everyone on the call knows about the 5 Ps, but we focus on the first one and the last one. Trying to encourage more actors across the Australian economy and society to make that pledge to a Paris-aligned, 1.5 aligned, ideally, commitment. And then the 5th P, the persuade. So I think Andrew mentioned the 3 A's before too. So we also looked at those 3 A's to make sure that everyone we engage with is doing their best in terms of advocacy and action. And oh gosh, I can't remember what the other A was, but there you go. Yeah, so that's Better Futures Australia, where
ambition,
and many
action,
of you
accountability, advocacy.
That's it. Yep, ambition. So the pledges, yes, and many of you probably know our sister alliance that was the first of the alliances for climate action, which is We Are All In, and works closely with the We Mean Business Coalition. So,
Okay, thank you for that. Now, I take the right of asking the first question because I haven't seen any come through. That's okay. And it's this, and it's very topical. We all know what the Trump administration has been doing in terms of dismantling its commitment to climate action. But overnight, we saw Canada elect through the governing party, probably the very first climate change prime minister. And by that, I mean the appointment of Mark Carney to the role of Prime Minister of the leading ruling party in Canada, and subject to an election at some point in the not too distant future, potentially the return of and ruling in his own right. I'm interested in thoughts around not so much the politics, because I think that's for another day and for other platforms, but what does the significance of that appointment have to the debate and discussion at a global level, which will obviously influence Australia's input after the election, in terms of ambition? And does it meet an opportunity for at least balancing what's going on in the US, or do we still find that there will be a strident discourse in relation to the ability to find that the ambition plans that have come forward for Belém being of such a high level that they are actually going to move the dial? And in that context, Lisa, I will start with you, because I wanted to go back to what we announced late last year through Mission 25. And at that, I gave, I thought, a very rousing speech around how we are building on what we've already done, rather than feeling as though we have to have all this new ambition. We're actually building on earlier ambition, which Ilona has quite rightly identified. We may or may not get 42.6%, almost 43, isn't it? Kind of. It's like an exam test.
Yeah.
But what do you think? What do you think is the possibility or the pragmatic opportunity of having a Mark Carney on a world stage now, given that he was instrumental in the development of the TCFD along with Mike Bloomberg and that whole apparatus in relation to ambition by business and finance? Firstly, Lisa, then we'll go to Ilona, then we'll go to Andrew.
Yep, it's something we've been thinking a lot about in the context of post-election scenarios domestically as well. So how do we keep Australia on track to a clean economy? We're working on thinking about what the multi-level agenda can do. So subnational governments, the cities, the states and territories, in partnering with the private sector, businesses, and also the investment community, for how they can continue with the push to decarbonise those emissions-intensive regions and create those clean economies of where we need to be. So yes, that's really at the heart of it. And then there's also the element of what are those pieces that if the political ambition isn't there, then where can those subnational non-state actors step in? So the business community with the corporate determined contribution, and then our local and regional determined contributions, and then also looking to Frank Giotto's suggestion of the NDC plus. So how do you apply the NDC plus to which, I think the other panelists spoke a little bit to this, that NDCs need to go beyond just the 2035 emission reduction target. It's actually looking to all the things that need to happen across the economy with those sector-specific implementation plans, with the just transition elements and other factors built in for the equity and fairness, and making sure that the resources can be allocated where they need to be to keep the economy on track. The NDC Plus also includes those climate finance and fossil fuel phase-out targets, which we know are really critical. Did that answer your question, Andrew? I'm not sure. It was very wordy.
Kind of, sort of. But to be fair to Ilona, because it maybe is not the right question to ask her, but I'll reframe it by going to the point about building on. What's your observation, given that you do work with a lot of business, around the appetite for not so much the ambition conversation, because that in itself is always fraught with fascinating intelligence around sectors and CEOs' positions. But what do you feel is the ability of business to step up to building on a more ambitious NDC in Australia than the 2031 was?
Right.
Look,
Sorry.
No,
was that to me or to Lisa?
Not you, Lisa. I noticed.
Okay.
I noticed.
Yeah. So what I would say is, every discussion we have with clients and with industry around Australia's response to the climate emergency and the technologies, the development, the investment that needs to enable us to step up. A lot of it comes down to regulatory certainty, and the biggest issue that we see with our clients is the sort of concern around uncertainty, whether it's because of short election cycles and focus being on one technology or another, or so there's that issue around stability in terms of long-term policy settings. Then the second component of that is the regulatory, call it red tape, green tape, whatever it is, which is preventing the projects that are able to support our transition to a low carbon economy to get off the ground quickly and efficiently. And when you look at it taking 6 years to get an environmental approval for a wind farm or a solar farm, or some of these developments that will accelerate our ability to achieve those targets, I think they're the things that we need to address. Business can be as ambitious as the policy settings are, if they have that policy certainty and the regulatory barriers are sort of broken down a bit to enable that investment to flow.
Yeah, I remember in my planning days when I got the approval for the Capital Wind Farm, it took 9 months, and it was all state-based. Go figure. Thank you for that. Last word to Andrew, and it's very much a case of, Andrew, what should we in Australia be doing? How quickly should we be doing it? Silly question. And what's the lasting message you want to leave with us about the work that we've got to do after the election in a very short period of time in the lead up to one of the most instrumental COPs of recent times? Not hard question.
Yeah. All the answers in 2 minutes. No, I would just say, obviously, the election is coming, and that will determine things. But I think, from my very distant sort of stance, would be to really quickly work out what is the kind of political messaging that can cut through, depending on what the colour of the government looks like, to try to meet the moment internationally. And it's become sort of our day-to-day now to really think, just in each country, what is it we can say, what kind of language can we use to make these messages cut through, that this is business sense, and this is about future competitiveness, and this is about an accelerating energy transition, and just using the language which works. So there won't be much time, but to really galvanize as the kind of pro-climate community very quickly around what is it you can engage the government with to make sure this happens, or that the NDC comes through strongly. You're sort of trying to depoliticize it as much as possible, I guess. So yeah, in general terms, I would say that's. And
thank you for that. And on to Belém, which is a nice cue to all of our audience that BCSD Australia has announced its COP30 events program already, and I think it will be online on our website. If not, no, it won't be today, because our head of comms comes from Queensland and told me this morning that they haven't had internet or power for 3 days. So look out for that on our website. We'll have a monthly update on what's happening at COP, and I'm hoping that Ilona and Andrew and Lisa will join with me at least on 1 or 2 of those events to give you all an update on what's going to be, as I say, one of the most significant and historic COPs of all time. not the least of which is we've got to find out where we're going to stay if we can get there. But that's for another day. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you so much for joining this event as part of Core SID 2025. If you are interested in any of the other events, they are very, very, very clearly outlined on Humantix, and or go to the Core SID website, which I think is coresid.org.au, and very easy to register. Almost all of them are at no cost. Some are a couple for fee, and they still have ticket sales available, but really, really would welcome them. They take up Andrew's point in relation to communication and language. So for now, though, thank you very much for joining us. My name is Andrew Petersen. Look forward to seeing you in the future on another BCSD Australia event. Thank you so much. Bye for now.
Thank you, everyone.